I went down and I saw the endo, and he diagnosed me in 5 minutes and told me I had type 1 diabetes, and I was just kind of in shock, and I really didn't know what it meant, but he told me that no one had ever gone to the Olympics in an endurance sport with it, and that I could keep skiing at the club level, but that the Olympics was not going to happen. He was a good doctor. He just had never seen anyone do it. He was trying to let me down easy, but I wasn't going to be let down.
Welcome to the Game Plan T1D Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Benger. This podcast is focused on disproving the idea that type 1 diabetes is a roadblock by showcasing success stories from athletes and performers with T1D. For more information on this topic, please visit our website, www.gameplant1d.com, or follow us on social media at Game Plan T1D. This episode of the Game Plan T1D Podcast features athlete, diabetic, and all-around good dude Kris Freeman. Kris has performed in the sport of cross-country skiing with dominance and consistency, competing in hundreds of professional races on his way to establishing one of the most successful cross-country skiing records the United States has ever seen, including a first place in the World Championships in the under-23 age bracket, a fourth place in the 2009 World Championships, 17 national titles, that's right, 17 national titles, as well as 4 trips to the Olympics. Kris's performances solidify him as arguably the best American cross-country skier of the sport's modern era. But the story of Kris Freeman the athlete extends well beyond skiing. Kris now competes in triathlons and other adventure racing type events. Most recently, Kris won the Sea to Summit Triathlon, in which contestants swim 1.5 miles in a tidal river, bike roughly 90 miles to the base of Mount Washington, and cap off the event with a run to the peak. Kris beat out all other competitors, completing the event in 5 hours and 44 minutes after the swim was canceled due to inclement weather. Kris is an outspoken diabetes advocate and uses his platform built on his successful athletic career to inspire other diabetics. During this podcast, Kris and I discuss skiing, the trial and error of dialing in management systems, leveraging advanced diabetes technology, and much, much more. For such an accomplished athlete, Kris was kind, laid back, and incredibly down to earth. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Kris Freeman. All right, welcome to the Game Plan T1D Podcast. Today we are sitting down with Kris Freeman. Kris, how are you doing today?
I'm doing real well. How are you?
Doing well. So we talked a little bit earlier about a little run you got in with Shira, your dog you got up here. What was the run about today?
Well, I woke up this morning and I'm still really, really tired and sore from the long triathlon I did 2 days ago. I wasn't sure I was going to get out today, but my dog needed some exercise, so I ran over the Welsh and Dickey mountain loop with her. I actually feel better now than I did beforehand, so I think I'm glad I did it.
What is the current training schedule looking like? We were talking a little bit about before how you're diving into and exploring triathlons a bit more now.
So I was pro cross-country skier from the time I was 19 until this past spring, so 18 years of professional skiing, and I put in base training between 700 and 1,000 hours of endurance training a year for 18 years, so the base is really huge. So going from cross-country skiing into triathlon, it's more about learning skills than it is getting fit. So I've been spending a lot of time with a swim coach, getting that type of technique work down, because swimming is all about technique, and putting a lot of time in the saddle, getting comfortable in an aero position. But as far as actual hours of training, it's maybe 15 hours a week. It's actually quite a lot less than I used to do.
Yeah. It's funny, and I was mentioning this earlier as well, but driving up here, for our listeners, we were just south of the White Mountain National Forest. Is a lot of your training, to me, this seems like a fantastic place to be based if that's the type of training you want to do. Are you staying local for most of this training?
Yeah, for cross-country skiing, this is like a giant playground, this town. I live just beneath the Franconia Notch, where the Old Man the Mountain used to be, Cannon Mountain, Lafayette, the Franconia Ridge. It's all beautiful trail running, amazing hiking. The roads around here aren't very busy, so for roller skiing, it was pretty perfect. And now for biking, it's some of the best riding in the world. And I actually grew up 40 minutes south of here. I would drive to Waterville Valley to ski probably 4 or 5 times a week. And now I live a 10-minute drive from Waterville Valley, and I ski there 7 days a week. So,
talk a little bit about how do you feel that growing up in this environment led you to these sports, or was it more just organic, you know, in your heart, this is kind of what I want to do, and it just so happens to be coincidental that I'm in one of the best places in the world to train for it?
So I was very fortunate in the area that I grew up. I grew up in Andover, New Hampshire, and Andover's a really small town. It's a half hour north of Concord. Most of that town is made up of a private high school called Proctor Academy. They had their own alpine mountain, their own private alpine mountain, their own ski jumps, and 10 kilometers of cross-country ski trails. And they also had high school coaches that volunteered to coach the town kids from the time they were 5 years old. Mm-hmm. So I joined just a town club program and started competing when I was 5 years old in skiing.
Wow.
And it was just like anything else. You know, I played soccer, I played baseball, there was swimming, tennis, kayaking offered in my town, so I just picked up any sport. But skiing was always what I gravitated to. And I actually was a very serious ski jumper as well until I was 16. And then I decided to focus just on cross country. So for sure, I'm a product of my environment, but skiing has definitely always grabbed my attention.
So you got to tell me, how does one fall in love with arguably one of the most grueling, you know, subcategories of skiing? You know, I think you were mentioning the ski jumping, some of those more immediately gratifying type events. What about the kind of arduous nature of cross-country skiing kind of grabbed you?
Well, there is actually an Olympic sport that's kind of bizarre called Nordic combined skiing. Mm-hmm. And that's a combination of ski jumping and cross-country skiing. So it is, just as you said, it's kind of diametrically opposed. One is instant gratification and one is an endurance sport. Mm-hmm. So the people that do that sport are kind of interesting. I actually realized in my early teens that I wasn't into the instant gratification. I was much more into the skiing side of the hard work, the endurance side of the sport, and the other people in Nordic combined, and that's when I went to cross country. I never liked stopping, for one thing. Like alpine skiing, I would actually get kind of bored sitting on the lift. Mm-hmm. I liked that every day I went out and cross country skied, I learned something a little different that made going down the track that much easier and just a little bit more like floating along the snow. So it just it becomes addictive.
Was it immediate success and immediately being a standout once you started? Like, people are like, man, Kris, you have some serious potential here. Or was it, you know, this is something I love and I really want to devote time to, you know, honing this craft?
It depends on your perspective of what immediate success was. Like, I was always good at skiing, but, you know, I was maybe in the top 10 in New England in cross-country skiing until I was 13, 14, and then I took a giant leap when I was 15 and I won junior nationals. So if you it's funny, you're probably like, well, at 15 you're having great success, but I still remember being 8 and not winning. So
yeah.
But it did start coming at around 15 and then 16, even more success. I won the overall junior national championships. And for sure that was exciting. But at the time I wasn't thinking like Olympics. I was thinking college scholarship.
Yeah.
And working it that way.
Absolutely. So when did the word Olympics first kind of enter your mindset?
When I was 18, I went to when I was 18, I started thinking it might be possible. And that was actually a really hard decision for me because I was offered a full scholarship to the University of Vermont, and at the same time I was offered full-time training with the U.S. ski team that would be mostly paid for in Park City, Utah. coming out of high school, and that's a hard age to decide what to do. In the end, I decided to go to college for a year, and while I was at college, I realized that I was majoring in skiing anyway, and I was doing fine in school, but I wasn't applying myself. All I wanted to do was be on the road skiing, and I missed the first 3 weeks of the second semester racing in Europe, and I came back and my professors asked me who I was and things like that. So after a year of that, I decided to go the U.S. ski team route, and I never looked back. 2 years later, I made the Olympic team. So
that's amazing, and it's funny just the timing of how things would work out. You're a young kid, 18, 17 years old, and you make that decision to say, all right, skiing is my passion. I'm going to pivot away from UVM. I'm going to pivot away from school and sort of stability, known stability, and pursue this passion. And then about a year or two later, at age 19, we have a diagnosis. Kind of take us through how, was it particularly jarring? I imagine it would be. What were some of your immediate reactions to that news?
So the timing of my diagnosis was so I decided not to go back for my sophomore year, and I moved out to Utah in June, and the diagnosis came in August. I didn't get symptomatic, so I didn't go to the doctor because I felt bad. My diagnosis actually came at a fasting glucose test that they gave all of their athletes, and it came back at 240. And as you know, that's not really a symptomatic blood sugar, So the nurse was all alarmed, and I'm like, what's the big deal?
Yeah.
What's normal?
You know,
and they told me to see an endocrinologist, and of course, who the hell knows what an endocrinologist is when they're 19?
Yep.
So I went down and I saw the endo, and he diagnosed me in 5 minutes and told me I had type 1 diabetes, and I was just kind of in shock, and I really didn't know what it meant, but he told me that no one had ever gone to the Olympics in an endurance sport with it, and that I could keep skiing at the club level, but that that the Olympics was not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And people hear that and they're like, "Oh my God, what a jerk!" And this was a good guy. He was a good doctor. He just had never seen anyone do it. He was trying to let me down easy, but I wasn't going to be let down. That afternoon, I actually went training with the team, but we were just in a recovery session. We were kayaking, and they were just being themselves, flipping each other over and stuff. But I was in tears. I didn't know what was going to happen. So I started studying and learning as much as I could about the disease and trying to find something that made me think I could still do it. And what really gave me the most inspiration was just the fact that new insulins had come on the market. The fast-acting insulin had only been around for about 5 years at that point. Glucose monitors were faster and more accurate. And I was looking at it, and I was like, well, with the old insulin, maybe you couldn't do it, but maybe with the new insulin, you can. Mm-hmm. And so I kept trying, and in all honesty, I think the U.S. ski team kept backing me because they were ignorant of what having diabetes means. Yeah. They certainly didn't support me emotionally in the way that I needed to be. They basically said, "Oh, it's no big deal. Don't worry about it." Meanwhile, I'm dealing with all of going to the pharmacy, highs, lows, weight gain because I had been eating like crazy and not absorbing my food, and all on my own. So it was a lot to take in.
Do you think you immediately, after getting that diagnosis and being told no, did it immediately for you turn to fuel, inspiration, motivation, whatever you want to call it? Or was it more just thinking about what exactly is this thing that I'm dealing with? And since then, is that now a place you go to in some of your events, some of these long, grueling events, where you kind of think back to that moment or other moments where you've been told, Kris, no, it's not going to work out?
Certainly from a motivation standpoint, when I think about that diagnosis, it's like, I got diagnosed with a chronic, lifelong disease, and my first thought wasn't like, oh my God, am I going to die? am I going to be okay? It was like, can I keep ski racing?
Mm.
So when you realize that that's your first priority, getting outside for that second session isn't really that hard anymore, because you know that's what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So that was good from the motivation standpoint. But at the same time, a lot of what started motivating me was fear that I couldn't do it, and proving to myself that I could, which is never a healthy place to be. You should working off of fear is a bad place to be. I had a fair amount of success anyway, but it's not a fun way to do anything.
Obviously, that news, you learned how to motivate yourself using that. And you talked about the fear aspect, which may not be the most healthy. What were some of the more positive sources of inspiration that you had? Perhaps other skiers. I know you've mentioned Bill
Koch.
Yeah. Bill Koch, Vermont skier, Olympic medalist. Were there fellow skiers? Were there books, articles that you looked to for inspiration? What else did you use as fuel during this period?
Well, I looked for other athletes that had been successful with diabetes, and I read about Gary Hall Jr., the swimmer. He took a gold medal in the 50-meter freestyle, and I believe it was in Atlanta in '96. I took some inspiration from that, except that his event's 20 seconds long, and my longest Olympic event was 2 hours, so there was definitely a disconnect there. But I thought, okay, it's not unheard of. There has been athletic success. The technology is getting better, and I really believe that no one knew what was possible with fast-acting insulins. Then glucose. Then pumps started getting more innovative. Continuous glucose monitors came into the scene. Even the resources that type 1s have now for taking care of themselves are just so light years ahead of even when I was diagnosed that no one can say what's possible with diabetes or what's impossible, because there's no way to know because it's so new.
Yeah, it seems that we're at the point now that, really every season there's a new version of a piece of equipment that has dramatic improvements in capabilities.
Yeah.
The fact that we have technology that allows us to integrate our diabetes management right to our cell phone, huge advancement.
Yeah.
And it almost seems like I do think we are accelerating in terms of the technological innovations that are helping us.
Right, people keep focusing on when's there going to be a cure, and I'll be honest with you, when I got diagnosed, I looked at it, I'm like, I'll have to deal with this for 10 years, and then I'll be cured. Well, that didn't work, so instead of just sitting around waiting for a cure, I've been very, very active in embracing whatever new technology I thought would work. That being said, I was diagnosed in 2000, and I didn't start using a pump until 2008. And I adopted the Omnipod at that point, mainly because I was getting to the point where I was trying to fine-tune things with my insulin so much that I was taking 10, 12 injections a day. I was taking 2 types of basal insulin. I was taking Humulin as well as Lantus, because Lantus is a 24-hour long-lasting. Humulin was a 12-hour. And I was finding that if I took enough Lantus that I wouldn't rise when I slept, I'd go low all day when I was trying to ski train. So I'm taking 2 different long-lasting insulins plus 8-9 injections of Humalog every day. I'm like, I need to get on a pump. But the doctor I was working with had a lot of concerns that the tubing might freeze in a traditional pump.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, the coldest temperatures we race at is -4 Fahrenheit. And we're looking at, I'm wearing a layer of long underwear and a Lycra suit. There's not a lot of insulation there. So the main thing that was cool about the Omnipod was that it sat on the body, and the body kept it warm. So that was what first attracted me to it.
Yeah.
And then once I started using a pump and I could change my basal rates on the fly, I was like, I'm never going back.
It's huge.
Yeah.
Huge. And I was looking at doing some of the background research for this interview. Kind of, you posted about, all right, here was the event, here's how I did, but then again, you also posted, here's how I adjusted and tailored my basal rates, which I think is hugely important for other aspiring endurance athletes like yourself. I did want to ask, I think you have by far the most unique Omnipod placement sites. I saw for the most recent Sea to Summit triathlon, which Kris won, of course. You had 2 Omnipods on your upper back.
So I started wearing on my upper back, actually on the suggestion of an Omnipod representative that probably wants to remain nameless because it's not an FDA certified spot. But so when I'm racing, I'm running about 5% body fat. There's not much body fat anywhere. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really matter if I'm wearing it on my stomach or I'm wearing it on my back. We're looking at the same amount of subcutaneous fat anywhere I go. I've worn it. If you look right now, I'm actually wearing it on my chest. Mm-hmm. So more than looking for places with more body fat, I look for places that are out of the way and where I have the least number of occlusions. Knock on wood, I've never had an occlusion in a race wearing it on my back. For whatever reason, that spot just works great.
In addition to trying to find those pump placements, talk us through how you what was the trial and error? Was it a trial and error approach with adjusting the basal rates to find something that would kind of be the perfect solution for, you were mentioning some of these events are upwards of 5, 6, 7 hours of racing.
Well, initially, if we back up to when I was first diagnosed, there was a huge trial and error period, trying to figure out what the right amount of insulin was, that I wouldn't go low, but I wouldn't go high. I actually tested myself at the U.S. ski team gym on a treadmill. We had a 10-foot wide treadmill that I could roller ski on. And so in a lab setting, I could go at race effort and be relatively safe, Mm-hmm. It was kind of funny. The lab technician at the U.S. ski team didn't want to let me do it because he was worried about my health. But then after we did it, he wanted to publish the data. But anyway, I got a baseline of where to start. But the thing about a lab setting is there's no race nerves. There's no consequences. So you get into an Olympic race and you got the adrenaline, you got the cortisol, changing everything in your body. Adrenaline sending out extra glucose from your liver, cortisol making your insulin in your bloodstream not work. It took a lot of trial and error to get it right. What I was able to discern from the lab testing was I felt best racing with a blood sugar above 120 and below 180. If I was down around 100, even though that's a perfectly healthy blood sugar, something in my body was signaling to me, hey, we're running too close to the line here. We don't want to go any lower. Mm-hmm. And if I got over 200, the lactate in my body would actually spike with the higher blood sugar. And lactate, for those who are listening and don't know, is basically the substrate that your body makes when you go anaerobic, which means you're working so hard that your body can't keep up with the oxygen you demand. And so if your blood sugar is over 200, you actually create more of that lactate. And lactate is basically the stuff that makes you feel crappy when you exercise and makes all your muscles hurt.
Is it an active thought process for you during a race, trying to discern, all right, I'm on mile X. This is how, my legs should be feeling. Or maybe is this potentially a hypoglycemic episode that I'm about to enter into? Is it easy for you to discern those at a later stage in a race?
Unfortunately, the difference between a natural bonk and a artificial bonk from insulin feels the same. Mm-hmm. The difference is that an artificial bonk comes on faster, harder, and takes you out. Whereas a natural bonk is just like, I don't feel very good, and 20 minutes later, I feel even worse. When it's coming from synthetic insulin, it's like, I don't feel very good. Oh boy, I gotta stop. Mm-hmm. So I have really not had too many lows in races. I would say that lows that made me stop in a race, or I should have stopped and didn't stop, there's more of those than there are actual stopping. It's probably less than 10 over 20 years of racing.
Mm-hmm.
So, or 18 years of racing. So I've been pretty diligent in how I'm doing it, because we're talking about 500 races here.
Absolutely. So it sounds like you've dialed in the insulin equation, nearing a pretty darn perfect system.
I never want to say perfect. I am doing the best I can. I'm always looking for a better way to do it, but I am sure there is a better way to do it. I just haven't thought of it yet.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone has a better idea, I am welcome to hear it.
So let's talk about the kind of inverse of the insulin issue. You're taxing your body at an extraordinary level. The fueling and the nutrients that you're putting into your body are hugely important. I read in one of the articles about you that you were consuming at some peak levels of training upwards of 6,000 calories a day. Other Olympic athletes that I've heard about, Michael Phelps has the insane, 12,000 calorie diet. Where
I call BS on that one, but
8,000, 12,000, some just absurdly inhuman number. Where I think there's an interesting distinction is I think he has the latitude to be able to consume higher glycemic index foods, so things like starchy foods. He can throw down 5 to 10 pancakes for breakfast, and that's a really easy chunk of, there's 1,000, 2,000 calories. Boom, I'm done. I don't think diabetics enjoy that latitude, or if they choose to go that route, there's going to be, some consequences with regard to a blood sugar spike. And it's just a much more difficult equation to manage with those high glycemic foods. Talk about your diet during some of these peak training periods.
Well, as a cross-country, the normal methods for cross-country ski training is to train twice a day. You have your primary session in the morning and a secondary session in the afternoon. And it's not uncommon to go for a 3-hour, 60-mile roller ski in the morning and go for a 14, 15-mile run in the afternoon with about 4 hours separating it. That would be a big day, but it's not an uncommon big day. So with that type of schedule, what happens is the timing is super important. For instance, if I decided to eat a huge pasta lunch at 2 o'clock with 7 units of bolus, that bolus is still going to be active in my bloodstream by the time I go out for my run, and it's going to drive me low. So instead of eating at 2 before a 4 o'clock workout, I better at the latest eat at 1, mm-hmm. and I'd be better off eating maybe a smaller meal, more protein centric, some healthy fats in there, a lot of fiber, so I don't have to take a ton of insulin, so that insulin tail doesn't drive me down lower in the run, and then actually plan to eat carbohydrate throughout my workout and get the same amount of calories in through the whole time. Otherwise, I'm going to eat a bunch of carbs, do my workout, go low, eat a bunch of carbs again, and I end up with twice as many carbs as I wanted to eat that day. So planning my meal times with the nutrients I needed to get in through the day was definitely a challenge. And it starts when I woke up in the morning, what I chose to eat for breakfast to get through that first 3-hour workout, what I chose to recover. And I do the second workout, and then I would eat probably a larger dinner than most people would, because mm-hmm. I had the most time to make counter adjustments afterwards if I had a problem.
Yeah.
So, a nutritionist might say, well, that's not ideal. I'm like, well, neither is having diabetes.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I think as a diabetic athlete, carbs are this double-edged sword in that, I think a lot of endocrinologists and nutritionists with a focus in diabetes will say avoiding carbohydrates is really a great thing to do if you want to strive for stable blood sugar levels. At the same time, if you're taxing your body at a high level, carbohydrates are an important fuel source. So it kind of sounds like you've started to work it out with the timing of when you consume these carbohydrates as well. But talk about how you work those in as a diabetic athlete.
So I basically don't eat any high glycemic foods at mealtimes, so that I can take the smallest boluses that I can, so that I don't have a lot of insulin tail, overlapping insulin. If you think about injecting insulin. For example, in my body, if I'm using Humalog insulin, I inject. In about 15 minutes, it starts working. At about 45 minutes to an hour, it's at its peak effectiveness. But then it continues to drive sugar into my muscles for 2 more hours at an ever-diminishing rate. So you have to always take that into account. If you end up taking a giant bolus, then I'm going to be prone to go low for exercise for the next 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So I always have that in account with the overlapping insulin, and for that reason, I eat high fiber, whole grain, high protein meals throughout the day. Take a minimum of bolus before my workouts, and then actually plan to get the carbohydrates in that I would have normally eaten in the mealtime during the workout. Mm-hmm. That's when I might drink sport drinks. That's when I'll have an energy bar, and that ends up working really well. Because once the muscles are actually firing, they're actually working really hard. For instance, you mentioned I did the Sea to Summit triathlon 2 days ago, which is an insanely long event. It took me almost 6 hours, and I think I took a total of 2.5 units of basal over that time. And in that race, I never went over a blood sugar of 160, and I consumed 80 ounces of Gatorade, 3 Red Bulls, 6 ounces of cola, 16 ounces of sweetened iced coffee, and 5 or 6 ounces of straight up maple syrup.
Really?
On 2.5 ounces. And 2.5 units of insulin, because my muscles were working so hard.
Mm-hmm.
So you also have to take into account what you're doing.
Yeah. Another really interesting facet in the life of any diabetic athlete, and this is, I think, a part of the story that gets lost in the shuffle with all of the individual demands placed on the athlete, is the support network. I know, for me playing collegiate football, I think it took a little bit of time for me to fully open up to that support network. And I think when you get diagnosed as a teenager or as a young person, I grew up with diabetes, diagnosed at age 5. And I think you kind of internalize and just say, I'm going to take this on my own and be independent with this treatment. I'm going to, maybe open up with just my endocrinologist or my doctor, but it's really going to be me in charge of this. Talk about your support network, and was that a network that you were able to rely on and leverage fully immediately, or did it take time to open up to that network and those people and those role players so that you could really leverage that community to its fullest potential?
Well, there was 2 problems that I had working with the US ski team. One is that I personally had no control over who was the head coach. And the first coach I worked with at the US ski team was just absolutely awful. He told me, this is your problem. You're going to have to deal with it. Basically, be a big boy. And I didn't know why, but I was real angry. And I got depressed, like full-on depressed, training for my first Olympics. It's interesting that I had so much success at that first Olympics, because if you read psychology books about sports, about where your head's supposed to be at, mm-hmm. my head was not where it was supposed to be at. And somehow I came away with some really mind-blowing performances at that first Olympics. So I don't know how. So it makes me question sports psychology in some ways. And then, that coach left. We got a new coach in for a couple of years, and that guy was great. He was, every race that we went to, he would give the race organizers glucagon and let them know what was happening and tell them in a cheery way, I had diabetes, but it wasn't, don't worry, just this is what you do if there's a problem. I've never needed glucagon, by the way. But then he left, and the new guy came in, and he admitted to me that he just forget that I had diabetes. In that instance, I think it was partially my fault, because I would kind of hide what I was doing. Not in the sense that, I'd pull out and give myself a shot at the dinner table, because that's what I did, or I'd pull my PDM out after once I started using an Omnipod. I never hit it that way, but I didn't talk about it. I didn't talk about what I needed. I didn't talk about the difficulties unless I really needed something. And I think that was partially a defense mechanism. And, I've never thought of myself as an identifier. I'm a diabetic. That's not an identifier for me. And I didn't want anyone else to identify me that way either. I'm a skier. I've got diabetes. That's the way I think about it. I'm not ashamed in any way of having diabetes, but it's not a personal identifier to me.
Yeah.
And I didn't want it to be with anybody else.
I think I relate to that in that for me it was never a active process of hiding it or being ashamed of it. It was more just something that passively occurred by the nature of the disease being sort of invisible. It's this seriously life impacting, influencing disease, but you could go your whole day and you do a few injections here or check your CGM a few times there. Otherwise, no one would know you have it. And I had guys, even through my senior year of playing college football, see me do a shot and they're saying, "What are you doing?"
Right.
And I think there's a world of difference that can happen from a support standpoint once you actively start reaching out to people and describing your story and telling them about just what it is, explaining what the heck a pancreas is, because most people don't understand what that is. When you say, they say, all right, you're giving yourself shots, or you're pricking your finger, what is this all about?
I'd have people that, I'd shared a room with for months on the road have an epiphany that, you mean your CGM and your Omnipod don't talk to each other? You have to tell it what to do? Like, seriously? No, there's no automation. But going back to who was my support network, sometimes, not all, the support network isn't always. One thing I've learned is that the people you support who support you maybe aren't all that good at supporting you, and you can sometimes become very dependent on bad support. And I was in a previous relationship where the risk of comparing my previous girlfriend to my wife, you never want to do that, but I'm going to do it on tape because I'm an idiot. If we were, at a movie theater and my glucose alarm went off, my previous girlfriend, who I was very reliant on for support, her first thought would be, "Oh my God, you're disturbing the other people in here because your alarm's going off. Can you shut that off?" And my wife has never had that first reaction. It's always like, "Oh my God, are you okay?" And that should be the reaction of your support people. Are you okay? Your alarm went off, not you're disturbing other people around you.
Absolutely.
And the fact that I couldn't see that was kind of crazy. The person that I probably became most dependent on for my dosing, talking about what was going on with diabetes from my racing standpoint, was a private coach that I had worked with while I was in college. He wasn't the college coach, but he was a private coach that I'd worked with for a long time, and I started working with him again after 2006, and he was my coach from 2006 until I retired. He had zero medical training, zero physiological training, and he was my number one resource for dosing advice for races, simply because he listened to me. And he remembered what I did the last time, and we could talk about it, and he knew what was going on in my life. So I think really what is the most important for a diabetes care person is someone who really cares, who listens, and is in tune with you.
I think that, again, speaks to just how different this disease impacts people, and especially athletes. We all have different demands facing us, but it's an incredibly, everyone's impacted in a different way by this disease. Rather than trying to find the flat out, this is the diabetes expert, this is the guru, I think perhaps, like you said, it's more that person that's willing to take what you said, be malleable, be flexible, and come up with a solution that's tailor-made to you, and one that's based off your feedback and your input. I think that perhaps is more important.
Well, a common conversation I would have with this coach, his name is Zach, would be, so say I had a 50K race, which would always be the most difficult one to dose for. That's a race that would take somewhere between 2 and 2.5 hours depending on snow conditions. And we try to figure out how much insulin I should dose for myself. I'd always do it. I'd always do the game this way. You tell me what you think, and then I'll tell you what I was thinking. And, you'd be like, well, I was thinking you should start out at a basal rate of 0.6 and then lower it to 0.3 at an hour and a half, and maybe suspend it with a half an hour to go. And I'd be like, gee, I was thinking 0.7 with a 0.25 and 45 minutes before. And then we'd look at each other, it's like, okay, we're thinking basically the exact same thing. This is good. This is probably going to work. And if we had too big of a spread, then we knew we had to sit down and have a real talk. If he was at 1.0 and I was at 0.2, then there needed to be a conversation. Why are we on different wavelengths?
Yeah. I think even after having the disease for a number of years, I think it's so hugely valuable to have another set of eyes, especially when it comes to pushing the envelope for new events, new longer distance events perhaps, because you might think your body is going to respond a certain way, but perhaps that other person just says, hey, yeah, let's suspend it with a half an hour left as opposed to an hour. And that makes the difference you need to perhaps go on to win that event.
Right.
Pivoting a little bit on the topic of support. So we've talked about who you lean on, but quite frankly, there are a lot of diabetic athletes and diabetics more generally leaning on you. So for the past, and correct me if I'm wrong, 10 years, you've been engaging in some diabetic camps with some fellow young diabetics. Would you talk a little bit about that experience?
So I've been working with Eli Lilly since 2002, and they started sending me to summer camps for kids with diabetes, I believe in the summer of 2004. It became known as the Lilly Camp Care Program, and I've gone to as many as 20 camps in a summer. To be perfectly honest, when I started, I never set out to be a diabetes role model. And then I started getting sent to these camps because my story was resonating with campers and their parents, and I liked seeing the reaction that I was getting, and I was like, wow, people are inspired by this story. I should probably keep telling it. And I wish, and then I realized that what I really was looking for when I was first diagnosed was a role model, was a path that I could follow to success and what I wanted to do with diabetes. So I think it's important that people that are successful with diabetes put themselves out there and show that it's possible. I fully intend to write a book about what I've done and go into great detail about how I've arrived at the various basal programs that I've done, go into the details of how I eat, when I eat, but also the emotional side of it and the depths. I mean, I mentioned 2 years after being diagnosed, I was clinically depressed for sure. I was a very functioning depressed person, but I was not happy. But I'm not there anymore. I've got my own website now, freemanfortitude.com. So even though I'm not racing full time as a Olympic aspirational cross country skier, I'm doing races that I've always wanted to do. Like the Sea Summit, I'm going to keep talking about that race simply because I heard about that race 10 years ago. My first reaction is, that sounds awesome. Now, I know that's uncommon that, let's go for a 1.5 mile swim in the ocean, ride 100 miles to Mount Washington, and run up it. That sounds like most people's version of hell. But it sounds like a fun day to me. And rather than, that's going to be really hard as a diabetic, I saw it and I thought, I'm going to figure out how to win that thing. And that's the type of thing I talk about on my website now. I have never not done something because I was diabetic. I've always looked at it, made a plan, and attacked it, and done my best to overcome it.
As important as these success stories are, as a role model, I think at the same time admitting and discussing and talking about experiences where, quite frankly, we're down in the dumps. Like you mentioned, the period of time where you were a little bit depressed, and it's I think to show other people that that is a completely normal feeling to have is so important. But at the same time, relate on that level, but then show, a way forward to higher levels of health to get out of that.
One of the things that I definitely learned over a decade of talking at these summer camps and was when I first started doing it, I very much glossed over the bad parts, and then in 2010 I had a very publicized low blood sugar episode at the Vancouver Olympics in the 30K, and what led to that was I was at a high point in my career. The year before, I had just been fourth at the World Championships. I was like a second from a medal. It would have been our first or second ever World Championship medal in Nordic skiing. And the press caught on to it. I was on the cover of Outside Magazine. I had features in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, New York Times. So I was getting media. And with media comes pressure, comes attention, comes stress hormones. And I thought I had stuff in check, but when I got to the Olympics, my blood sugars kept rising, my basal rates kept going up to cover that, and by the time I got to the race, I was on more insulin than I normally was on, and as a consequence, it's pretty predictable, everything adds up. I went low halfway into the race, fell over in the snow, and had to drink a 20-ounce Powerade and some goo before I could even stand up, and I decided to finish the race, which was an example of when I should really not have. But when that happened, the last thing I wanted was people to write about it and think about that, what that make that my Olympic career. But ironically, that is what kids at camp responded to the most was, wow, you almost passed out at the Olympics, and then you got up and you finished, and then you went to another one? So for sure, it's a hard disease, and only talking about the good things is just, it's not honest.
For you, was that was that your biggest learning experience perhaps as a diabetic? What were you able to take away from that experience?
I mentioned that I did learn that you can give yourself all the symptoms of chronic fatigue in a single day. By driving through a low. So, I had the extra sugar, and it got my blood sugar back up for enough time to ski a few more K, but then it went low again, and I had to drink more sugar, and I basically ended my season finishing that race. And what I suspect that I've done, and from talking to some other endocrinologists, I suspect that I gave myself adrenal fatigue in a single day just by pushing through, and which is why I say I should have dropped out. And it took me about 3 months to recover. I tried to race again, and there was just nothing there. There was nothing in my body to give. I came home after the Olympics, and I couldn't go cross-country skiing because I was too tired, so I'd do some downhill skiing, and then I'd get sick, and then I'd go downhill skiing, and then I'd get sick again. And then about 3 months later, all of a sudden I went for a run and I felt better instead of horrible. Now, true chronic fatigue takes years to get over. This was a artificial version. So what did I learn? I learned that when you have a true blood sugar crash and you can't feed your way out of it, you stop. And I also started looking around for better technology at that point, and I believe Dexcom was on the 7. They called it the 7 at that point. My same doctor who directed me towards the Omnipod had been hesitant to adopt the continuous glucose monitor because he thought that they weren't quite good enough yet, but he thought the Dexcom 7 was. Mm-hmm. So I got that. Huge change. Overall control started getting better. It was so basically the 2010 Olympics, I was still using blood sticks. I went to the Dexcom, another example of innovation making your life better, and I simply just don't know how I used to do things before I had it. And what I tell the campers is, I had this fatigue, I got better, didn't win an Olympic medal, but at the next race that I competed in, which was in Finland the next November, I beat the Olympic bronze medalist. So there you go.
I think something that would be useful for our listeners, and type 1, don't get me wrong, type 1 diabetes has no off days whatsoever. No off days at all, no time off at all. But when you have those really challenging moments and rough patches, how do you, as an athlete and a diabetic, hit sort of like a reset button? What is that process like? Do you have a routine after, and this could be recovering from that episode at the Olympics where you were down in the snow, or it could be a particularly just a rough day. We had a few more lows than we wanted. Is there a process for you where you say, all right, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to get back on the horse? How do you hit that reset button?
Well, I think the hardest thing about having that fatigue in particular, and the reason I was going alpine skiing, is my reset is training, being outside in the woods, working out. I like that feeling. I like going for runs in the woods. I like going for skis in the woods. I like exerting myself and getting that pushback from the body, and it just feels good. That's my therapy. But the other thing that I very much learned at the 2010 Olympics was the mind-body aspect. I lost control of my insulin dosage because I was too nervous, so I needed to learn how to relax. So I started meditating. I started doing yoga, and I was looking for some type of breath control routine that I could do before races. Ways to stay relaxed, and I would separate myself from the group, go into quiet rooms, do a stretching routine, or just do a really simple basic breathing session for 5 minutes, and that would noticeably change my blood sugars before a race. I could be lying in bed climbing, and I'd calm down, do your breathing, and things would reset.
Wow. Is that one of your, just trying to think on the topic of messages to the campers that perhaps transcend athletics, that you've learned that would still be relevant to them? Is that something that you tried to pass on? And what are some of those messages for you?
I always try to say that I'm an example of athletic success, but you can put this towards any type of academic success or art success. It's like, because you have diabetes, it should not stop you from doing anything that you want to do. And I'm very clear about that. Sports is just what I like to do. So,
tell us a little bit about more of the developing that meditation practice and how you kind of apply that. This could be on race day. This could just be in general, because I think that's something that, like you said, athletes, but also with regard to perhaps you're taking a big test in an academic setting. How do you leverage that, and what was that process like developing that practice?
Well, for me, the biggest challenge for anything is understanding it. So when I was first diagnosed with diabetes, I was terrified of it because I didn't know anything about it. So I learned as much as I could, because that was my coping mechanism, learning as much as I could. So with the breathing techniques, just as important as doing them and learning them, it was understanding the reason to do them. Understanding that being nervous is counterproductive in those situations makes me realize that when I'm getting nervous and I get those butterflies, that I'm not helping myself. Remove yourself from the situation, get a grip on yourself, and if you need to do the breathing to get it there, just focusing on breath. It's the most simple thing that we do. Just bring it down to the most basic level. I'm a breathing organism. That's all I gotta do.
In your years of research of the disease, do you think that the breathing aspect is perhaps the most important revelation you've had?
It's up there. Staying calm before a race. Staying calm before a race, staying calm before public speaking, staying calm before my wife gives birth in 6 weeks. We'll see how it goes.
Absolutely. Moving beyond perhaps athletics, and you just mentioned starting a family as well, what are some of your goals at this stage in your career? And these can be moving forward with triathlons as an athlete, or it could be beyond athletics. What are some of those things you're thinking about right now?
Well, I could have retired as an athlete after I stopped Olympic level skiing this past spring, but I thought from a diabetes advocacy standpoint, there was still more I could do and more that I wanted to do as an athlete. Not everyone relates to cross-country skiing. They don't know what it is. Everyone knows what running up a mountain is. Everyone knows what bike racing is. And I thought I could have success with it and enjoy it. And so far, it's going really well. And I've had, like I said, I started my website, freemanfortitude.com. I'm also on Facebook, Kris Freeman Fortitude on Facebook. And I'm getting good following and great reactions, and I'm interacting with people, and that feels good. So if I can be a positive example, I want to be. And I'm going to continue with that. One of the nice things about triathlon is that because of the duration of the events, you can be a little older and still be a top-level athlete. Cross-country skiing, you tend to peak out in your early 30s. I went to my fourth Olympics when I was 33, and this past winter, it all boiled down to I needed a top 2 at U.S. Nationals to go to my fifth Olympics, and I ended up third, a half a second from second in a 18-mile race, which was hard to take, but at the same time, I actually spoke to one of my old college teammates right after the race, and I'm like, I can't believe I missed my fifth by half a second, and he just looked at me, and he's like, he's been retired for 10 years, and he's like, 4, 5, who cares?
Yeah, that is...
What's the difference?
Yeah, better than most, I'd say, 4-time Olympian. Looking back, do you have a particular race or moment of a race or moment of training that stands out to you as one of the highlights of your career?
There's several. The best physical race I ever put together was at a World Cup in Finland, where it was a 9.3 mile classic race. Everything's in kilometers over there, so it was a 15-kilometer classic ski race, which is the traditional striding race. And I just had an unbelievable body that day and felt really amazing. Ended up fourth on the day, which no one likes to be right off the podium, but just like in cycling, we got dopers in this sport, and I got beat by 2 Russian skiers that were later banned from this past Olympics. So on that day, I wasn't the best skier in the world, but I was the second best skier in the world because there was a Norwegian who legitimately beat me. Other highlights, I won the under-23 World Championships by almost 2 minutes, which was just an unheard of margin. That was fun. Get to listen to the national anthem on the podium. You always love that. I had another 4th place at World Championships where I got beat by another doper who later got banned for using human growth hormone. So aside from diabetes, there's all kinds of things in life that can get in your way. Cheaters are always there, and cleaning up sport is going to be a very difficult thing to do. But I think it's really important, and I think it's important for clean athletes to, realize what's going on and just try to be the best athlete they can be.
What were the emotions like of representing the United States in your sport at the Olympic level, but then also at the same time representing, perhaps for the first time, the diabetes community in an endurance event at the Olympics?
I don't think I really embraced representing the diabetes community until later in my career, because I was still in that, not closeted phase, but just kind of pushing it aside phase. But once I embraced it, I for sure enjoyed it, and I felt good about what I was doing. And when you start feeling good about what you're doing, it's a hell of a lot easier to succeed. Representing the United States, of course, is an honor, and I wasn't groomed by my parents to be an Olympic athlete, and they never had those type of aspirations for me. I mean, they were really supportive of doing sports, and once they thought I could pay for college with sport, they were super psyched about it. But they didn't ever dream that.
Not the child prodigy.
I don't come from a long line of Olympians or anything. It wasn't like a family destiny or anything. So it was just really cool experience.
So starting to to wrap up and conclude here, one question we like to ask is, if you could send a message to a diabetic that's perhaps was just diagnosed, perhaps it's someone that's going through a particular rough patch, has had a bad week, some bad numbers, or perhaps an athlete who, like you, is at kind of a crossroads when they've been told maybe you won't be able to continue down this road, maybe you won't be able to chase that passion. What would be your message to those people?
First off, that with today's technology, absolutely anything that you want to do is possible with diabetes. That doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. I would recommend to anyone with diabetes to learn as much as they could about the disease, to learn about every treatment option that they have, to really understand. I'm at 78. That's not bad. I
got glucose tabs if you need them.
I'm good. To understand nutrition of everything, of all the foods that are around. Like, become your own best resource. As important as your support system is, being able to rely on yourself above everything else is more important. And I don't think I've ever had a discussion with an endocrinologist where he tells me what to do and I do it blindly. I understand where he's coming from. I discuss it with him. I challenge him, and I come up with what I want to do. And I think we're in a society with medicine where we look at doctors, we want a pill to make things better, and it goes away when you take the pill. And I think one of the biggest shocks people get with diabetes is they give you insulin, and you take it, but it doesn't go away, and it might not even work. It might actually make you feel worse. You might go low. You might go high. There's no magic pill that makes diabetes go away. This is a constant. And that being said, it is totally manageable, but you just can't let it get away from you.
I think an important word you used there was conversation. And especially where we're at with diabetes care now, with so much new technology emerging and a lot of new approaches, whether it's dietary or fitness-based, being recommended and advocated for, it needs to be a conversation.
Yes.
And you referenced earlier with your coach, what does the basal rate need to be? Here's my thoughts. Here's your thoughts. Let's weigh out the pros and cons and come to a consensus. And I think for our listeners, taking that advice to heart, whether it's with your doctor, your family, your friends, whoever those support people are in your life, have it be a conversation. And like Kris said, never, even from a diabetes healthcare professional or expert, take that advice as this is the best approach, hands down. There can always be improvements made, and there certainly is always room to tailor the care to better fit your life, your lifestyle, and your needs. So I think that's an absolutely huge piece of advice.
Thank you. And I can't stress enough the importance of understanding the nutritional makeup of your food. I've found that the majority of people I've spoken to enjoy what I call willful ignorance about their food. They don't really want to know what's in it because then they kind of feel bad about it. But don't feel bad about your food. Just eat the right food. And you can't eat the right food unless you know what's in it.
Yeah, it's almost like ignorance is bliss there. And
right.
I think in my personal life, and Kris, you can answer this from your side, but I think food is the biggest input that has the largest effect on our blood sugar. And it's tough because it does require a lot of effort to actively maintain the proper diet. But if you want to find a way and a path to stabler blood sugars, I think you start with what you're putting in your body.
Right. One of the most useful things I found was just I went online, I Googled the glycemic index. It gives a list of how fast carbohydrates break down in certain foods in your body. And I definitely use that to make food choices throughout the day. And 100% agree that diabetes care starts with the food, the insulin secondary.
So to end, we've talked a lot about challenges. Kris, what's the best part about being part of this T1D community?
One of the things that has always impressed me the most going to these camps is how mature young children can become when they're given a challenge. I've had a 5-year-old ask me what my carb to bolus ratio is. And I don't think I knew what a ratio was until I was 15. So it's impressive what humans can overcome, and not only overcome but thrive. So I'm happy to be in a community that isn't stopped by challenges.
I think, and I asked you the question, what would your message be to that struggling diabetic? And I think for me, looking back on coming up on 18 years of having been diagnosed with the disease, the message from my standpoint would be stronger because of it. However you want to define it, diabetes forces us to be more accountable at that point of diagnosis. And for me, it was age 5. For you, it was age 19. And whenever that diagnosis happens, there is such a higher level of responsibility put on that person from a dietary standpoint, from never going anywhere with that fast-acting glucose. All of these, constraints that are sort of put on you. And I don't even want to call them constraints. I would say, opportunities to become more independent. So I think, my message would be you're absolutely in the long run a stronger person because of it. Mentally, the growth that it forces you to go through is huge. 100%
agree. You did touch on planning is very important. I talk about all the things that I never letting diabetes stop me, but it doesn't stop me because I plan very carefully before I do them.
Absolutely. So what's training for tomorrow?
I am still resting from my 6-hour race. So tomorrow I'm going to go for a mountain bike because it's fun.
All right. Kris Freeman, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you. My name is Kris Freeman. I have type 1 diabetes, and I have a game plan.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Game Plan T1D podcast. For related content, please visit www.gameplant1d.com or follow us on social media at Game Plan T1D. Find your game plan.